Welcome to this episode of the Talent Forge, where we are shaping the future of talent development. I'm joined today by special guest Rebecca Prejean. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm going to correct myself, Prejean. I knew it and I said it. And then as soon as I said it, so just the audience, FYI, when you make a mistake, correct it, move on. I apologize, Rebecca. But why don't you tell the audience, wh how did you get into this talent development space? Let us know a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. In terms of how I got into the talent development space, I'd like to almost say I fell into it.
Mm,
I was doing graphic design at some point, and I actually got hired to train at a small startup, even though that's not really what my original intention was. They had hired me just for some phone work at the time, but our boss quit and they needed somebody to train. The guy had worked with me at a previous place and asked if I wanted to train people. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely, that's fine, kind of thing. And I loved it. Loved
that's
it,
awesome.
completely found my niche and stayed there for right around 5 years or so. But we scaled during that time from like a 5, 6 person in-office team to a 200 person international, both in-house and remote team. And I trained every single agent that we had
Wow.
for probably that entire 5 years.
How cool. It's funny, I actually fell into talent development myself. I was communications director at a university. I was asked to put together a program. I did it. It was really successful there. And somebody tapped me on the back and said, "Hey, you're good at this. You should do this for a living." I was like, maybe I will.
Like, that
So,
sounds great.
yeah, I love that. I love that shared background. So, Rebecca, one of your, and you have many, but one of your uh, expertise areas and focus areas is neurodiversity and inclusion in a training space. And for our audiences that may be somewhat new, can you help us understand what is that and what does that, how does that show up in the talent development space?
On the talent development space, it shows up in a variety of ways. So just to kind of give everybody an idea, we talk a lot about neurodiversity, and then you might hear neurodivergency, and you're like, I don't understand what's the difference, right? We're all different from each other anyway. So neurodiversity is that concept. It's that concept that we're all different. We all have different thoughts, different backgrounds that kind of, fire our thoughts and all of the things. So that's one concept. When we get over to specific conditions, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, bipolar disorder. Those are things that are fit into that neurodivergency. So almost like the more clinical thing where you actually have people like folks with dyslexia that see their letters backwards. That's not a made up thing. They see it that way. So they do something a little different than just thinking differently. They have an added layer to their difference, so to speak. So I always like to kind of make sure we differentiate those things. Now, in terms of talent development and how that shows up, that can present differently for a lot of folks. People who are on the spectrum, they may go into an interview, for example, for HR folks. They might go into an interview, they might not stare you in the eye. They might kind of look around, they might seem just a little different. They might be on the spectrum. If they seem like they can't stop moving a lot, they could have ADHD. If they might have difficulty maybe reading something or writing, because that is also something that can show up in dysgraphia,
Mm.
which is another neurodivergent condition. So there are a lot of different ways it can present, which can make it more difficult, of course, for us in talent development to really speak to those things. But there are always best practices, that we can use and that we can implement in our policies and procedures to kind of support those people when they need it.
Well, and we're definitely going to dig into some of those tips and tactics. I want to share with you, actually, it's interesting. My brother, who is 12 years my senior, I won't necessarily age ourselves here, but let's say he went to school a long, long time ago, and he's actually diagnosed dyslexic. And it was interesting because during his time in school, especially grade school, there weren't particularly very many resources. He was told, well, you should go into shop. You need to focus on this. They held him back, and he had a twin. They held him back a grade, and they said he was dumb. Now, here's the interesting thing. my brother, who then later figured this out and ultimately ended up getting his degree from the Eastern Michigan University, getting his master's degree from Michigan State University, getting his teaching certificate from Michigan State University, put himself through there while working full time and experiencing life. And now he is a special education teacher, and he has been for the last 20
Beautiful.
years because he saw it as, hey, there was nobody offering resources that fit me at that time. So if
Yeah.
we're thinking about this, and I don't want to say this is a new concept, but from a training, from a talent development space, neurodivergence and neurodiversity are, I'm going to call them underutilized, undervalued, underappreciated, and essentially they don't have that many resources. So help me understand, what would I do to make my trainings more inclusive to a neurodivergent population, or how might I think about those things? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of different things that
Yeah.
make us different. How could I think about my trainings or my talent development offerings or even my coachings to be more inclusive?
There's a lot of different ways. What I tell people is if you don't know where to start somewhere. And usually just starting small is a good place to go. So something as simple as closed captioning is
Mm,
something that can help folks that are neurodivergent. And it doesn't just help one condition, it helps multiple. And I will share with folks, part of the reason I got into this particular field is my son is autistic. Now, he is not, 18, 19, 20. Right now, he's 8. He just turned 8. But I remember, similar to your brother, as we were trying to get him support and services, when he was first diagnosed at the age of 4, it was so hard. It was
mm,
so hard to find resources for him, and we saw so many barriers and so many obstacles, and I'm like, "This should not be this way." But I also
yeah.
made that correlation between our experience and what I saw happening in the training rooms, in the training sessions that we were doing in adult classrooms. And all these people that we were just like, "You're just not catching on. Like, what's going on with you?" It's like, no, they just don't have that support. And some of that was because, I mean, in our spaces nowadays, we tend to have these things that we call trainings that are just videos of meetings. Um, they're not really
Right.
trainings. Um, Somebody speaking to a group of people for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours is not training, as we all know. And for somebody who's neurodivergent, it presents a myriad of issues. First and foremost, a lot of them aren't closed captioned. You might not have a transcript. You don't have keyboard navigation. You can't really rewind back and continuously kind of look and things like that. Then there's other issues like sound quality. They don't get to interact with it at all. They're literally just staring. And depending on what else is happening, they might have cognitive overload or sensory things going on where it's too much sound. We also like to record things with music, a lot of music, a lot of sound. Those things can be distracting. And I will tell people I'm a multimedia fanatic. So if anybody loves a good bit of flair and music and moving graphics and animations, it is me because I make them.
You got that
And I
creative
absolutely
background. Yeah.
yeah, I'm like, I love them, but there's a time and a place for it. And so when we're thinking about these trainings, when we're thinking about our onboarding, is a really important part and piece. We have to start thinking more purposefully as opposed to just getting something out there. We do have to start doing some more evaluations at the end of our stuff. We have to do assessments that actually can be measured over time. So you can come back a month, 3 months, however long, and actually see, is there progress here, and actually use that if there's accessibility in it, use that to kind of foster some more programs and some more initiatives to continue to build that, and build that business case that it's so hard sometimes to build.
So that is just absolutely insightful. And thank you for sharing your personal story
Yes.
on that as well. A lot of times we find, like, my study of behavior comes from, I wanted to understand my behavior, the behavior of my family. So we find that sort of like passion in many cases, from that personal experience, or us looking and saying, hey, wait a second, that's not right. We should be able to get more resources. I have friends who have
Yeah.
gone through that. Their son is about 8 years old right now too, and it's same experience. And I know it's not the same experience, but I know it's a shared experience that
Yeah.
finding different resources can be a challenge. So one of the things that I wanted to kind of hone in on, like, for example, I just did a keynote talk for the Association for Assistive Technologies. They provide a lot of different technological solutions for people with disabilities. And it was interesting because right before that training, the executive director sent me, hey, here's some things for you to keep in mind, and here's some things for you to think about. And it was really interesting. I've studied the science of bias, and I used that from the
Yeah.
diversity standpoint. So a lot of the things I was already aware of, but it was one of those where I was like, wow, why am I not asking some of these questions in my own questionnaire before I go into a training space? Why am I not learning? Is there people with mobility disabilities? Are there people with cognitive disabilities? Are there people with any kind of neurodivergence that I should be thinking about? And I know that sometimes, it may not be out there, it may not be communicated or anything, but I do want to accommodate. But I think sometimes trainers and coaches might be afraid to ask or afraid
Yeah.
to approach the subject. Help us understand and help the audience. How might we be able to be inclusive in a respectful and kind and considerate way? Because we obviously don't want to ask somebody, what's your personal neurodivergence? We don't want to go down that
Yeah.
road, but how can we really make sure that we're showing up the way that we need to show up for the people that are sitting in our room and that we're serving as trainers or coaches and HR people?
It's about being proactive, and reaching out beforehand. When we talk about being in the HR space, especially in like corporations, things like that, we have an uncanny access moment. We can talk to these people when they first get hired.
Mhm.
So you don't have to ask, so what's your specific one? You can actually have a broad general email, which most of us do, right? You have the form templates where you can say, if there's an accommodation that you may need, please know that, we're here to support you. Feel free to reach out to this specific person. So you should have an accessibility or accommodation liaison. Like that is a process that you should have in place, for
Smart.
people to know, who to reach out to. I was doing some research and some different things, and I actually came across a statistic from Harvard. They did some research and some surveys, and I believe it was like 49%, so almost 50% of people don't know who to even go to in their organization for accommodations. So that's
Mm,
something that we should be putting in those initial contacts when we're getting them excited to join our companies, right? We
right.
want them to feel wanted. This is their intro, to make the intro as good as it can be and to make them feel as welcomed as you want them to feel. You need to have that door open. It's not asking them individually, but it's saying, hey, we care enough about our people to have this set up. This is our liaison. This is the person you can go to and ask any questions about accommodations. If there's a concern about accessibility, you ask this person. There should be a process in place, when we're talking about our talent development and HR processes.
Absolutely. That's so smart, right? Making sure that that
Yeah.
process is systematic, that it's got that open door. Now, if I was to ask, and here's something that I know from my brother's personal experience, there was a number of times that people would say, "Does anybody need accommodations?" And he wouldn't speak up because
Yeah.
the stigmatization. And I know that 30 years ago, 40 years ago is very, very different than the world that we're living in now. But there is still
Yes.
stigmatization, and especially on some of the different neurodivergent capabilities. There are more stigmas than others. When we hear the word spectrum, I think most people now understand what that means, but generally it's I don't know. It seems to me, and I'll share a story personally in a moment, but I guess my question is, how can we better reach people that may have that fear of stigmatization? Or how may we be able to, and obviously, like you said, being proactive, doing these things in advance, but making sure that, that there is a safe space for somebody to be able to speak up and to understand that, hey, I'm not going to be evaluated. If I'm an audience member and somebody says, does anybody need accommodations? You look around and like nobody else is there. I ain't asking for
Rickets.
nothing right now, right? I don't want to be the one person. It's like I could
Yeah.
really use some kind of hearing support, or I could move
Yeah.
up to the front of the room. Nobody generally
No.
will speak up. How can we better create that safe space?
It has to become part of your culture. It has to. We have to see it integrated into DEI. We have to see it, and I know DEI is kind of dropping away a little bit in certain spaces. Like the state that I currently live in, you're not allowed to necessarily have those
Mm,
pieces of the organization. So I get that, but it still needs to be a part of the culture. So even if you don't have DEI, you can embed that into your leadership development so that people are aware of neurodivergency, they're aware of disabilities, they're aware of how to talk to people in a way that's respectful, where we're talking about language and some of these things. We're having these webinars, all these things, right? We have employee resource groups, we have webinars, we have meetings, we have all of this stuff. We have to start to begin to normalize the conversation. Once you've normalized it, once it becomes part of your culture, people won't feel as afraid to be stigmatized because there is stigma, there is bias. I mean, I see it. My son is autistic, yes. He's not nonverbal. He does have some very specific things, that kind of come with that, but we've seen it. I've seen it at work. People will treat folks like they're dumb, like they're not
mm,
smart, like they're not capable. I mean, I've seen my son just left to his own devices in certain classrooms, like completely ignored because they don't know how to approach. They don't know how to kind of interact with him because he's not as social. And so other things we have to really do, we have to check our own biases. Are we giving the most attention to the person who's the most vocal in the room just because they're engaging and they come up to you and say, "Hey, Sister Sally, how are things going?" At the water cooler. Are you kind of prioritizing those folks? Are you making sure that even the ones that are a little bit more quiet are seen, are heard, are, their opinions are being taken in? It starts with culture and it starts with making that a foundational piece. Um, if it's not part of the culture, if we're not talking about it, if it is these one-off moments in the room where we're like, "Hey, who needs an accommodation?" and expecting somebody to show up, they're not going to show up because you haven't shown up for them in any other piece of the company. And that's just the bottom line of it.
yeah, because then at that point in time, it just looks like you're, oh, I'm appeasing or I'm doing this, and it's not actually engaged if
Yeah,
you're not bringing it into the larger culture. That's really
exactly.
smart that's really smart advice. And, that it's really unfortunate. And I'm sorry to hear the challenges, but it sounds like your son's got a great mother that knows what she's doing and helping
Thank you.
navigate some of that space. So I'm glad you're here because I think in a lot of cases, you said something that really stuck out to me. Is people don't know and they don't know how to help and they don't know how to
Yeah.
provide resources. They don't know how. And that's a big part of why I'm really excited about this conversation because I'm hoping that that young trainer out there, or maybe that even that seasoned trainer that doesn't have the experience or the background in this, can take some of this knowledge and say, hey, you know what? How can we modernize our learning and development programs? How can we
Yeah.
modernize our training and our coaching and our culture to have this level of inclusivity? My question for you, Rebecca, is going to be, let's take just a tool, okay? And I'm not saying no one loves death by PowerPoint, but let's be honest, in so many trainings, there is still an avid use of PowerPoint all over the place. Okay, so how might I rethink things like my images, my fonts? What might I consider to be more inclusive to the neurodivergent population and say something like a tool like PowerPoint?
Great questions. And I love a good PowerPoint. I don't
Me
hate
too.
PowerPoint.
I know me too, but
I'm like, I love a good PowerPoint as long as it's done well. So what I like to tell people, problem we have with PowerPoint is that we like to cram everything in, and we still only like to have it be maybe 5 to 10 slides with all the things. So if you are wanting to make them more accessible, you've got to make things more clear. You do have to have bullet points that are shorter, maybe 4 word phrases, so that people who are watching it have time to actually digest it. Additionally, what I like to have people do if they ask me about this, I do like them to provide like a PDF version.
Hmm.
So somebody has a different option other than looking at the screen, simply because of sensory things, cognitive overload, just a myriad of stuff, right? And they have that opportunity to go back. In terms of images, we have this blanket thing where we say simplified images. That doesn't mean that it has to be boring, but you do want to be careful, especially if you happen to be a designer or somebody on this particular session listening to this. You do want to be careful of things that have like depth. So things that have a lot of shadow, things that have like a
Mm.
bunch of colors. You want to make sure that you strip a lot of that down because some people that have low vision, they might not have as good as depth perception as somebody who doesn't, have a neurodivergent condition. So you definitely want to be mindful of those things. You also want to be mindful of color contrast for people who might be colorblind. So a lot of people do these crazy things with color, or they think that color doesn't matter. Color absolutely does matter. So try to
There's
keep
a
it.
lot of psychology in color too. Absolutely.
Yes, there is. So please keep it. I usually try to keep it to maybe a handful of colors, if that, maybe three, four. There's a lot that you can do with maybe three colors. I promise you, it doesn't have to be a cacophony of color blast.
You hear
In
that,
terms
audience? This is coming from a
of
graphics person.
a
Don't
designer.
over, yeah, don't take this and go back out and have 700 colors in your PowerPoint. Not necessary.
It really does not have to be necessary. If you have video or sound, make sure that there are options to turn those things off or at least pause them. Um, again, I love music in the background of videos. I just that's just a thing I love. But I do make sure if I'm creating like an e-learning in particular, that there's a trigger somebody can just kind of turn that off. Um, because it can be distracting. And
Smart.
you also, yep, and you also ask for fonts. So fonts, the general rule is no less than 12 point font. That's why you can't cram all those words onto that slide. So it does need to be at least 12 point or higher. And make sure you keep simple fonts. So Calibri is a nice one. Arial is a nice simple font. So not cursive, things that look really fancy, and I won't lie, often look very, very pretty. When you're doing certain things, it can still look just as good with simple fonts. Some of it, I tell people a lot, some of this is artistic principles, artistic thoughts. So I encourage a lot of designers, especially instructional designers, go do a foundational arts class and just learn some basic principles of art, like balance, color, composition, and that really does help a lot. I know it sounds kind of weird to some folks, but been drawing since I was 5. I promise you
Wow.
that
Okay.
it helps a ton.
So you can laugh at me the way that the graphic designers in my company do. I used to design everything in PowerPoint, and then I would turn it over to somebody that actually had graphic design talent, and they would fix it for me. But yeah, so
Hey.
I am definitely a fan of the PowerPoint, and I love your tips here. It was interesting to me when I did that keynote for the Association for Assistive Technology. One of the things that they recommended, and I thought this was a complete gap. I mean, this was just I missed. I didn't think about it. They said when you have an image on there, especially when you're working with a population that may um, have a visual disability, that you need to describe the images. And when I started
Yes.
to go back, so I've been going back through all of my different PowerPoints and looking at the images that I had and say, could I describe this image in 5 words or less? So it's really funny that you said keep it short. I never put a lot of text on mine. It's usually like one statement and then I speak to that statement. But
Mhm.
that's like, here's the lesson. Now we can talk a little bit about that, so on and so forth. But I never really thought about having to describe my images.
Yeah.
And in my
Alt
coaching
text.
program, yeah, sure, it makes logical sense now. And I'm just like, this is a gap. This is an unconscious bias. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I will be better. And I actually took that into my coaching program where I'm coaching trainers and coaches like, okay, here's an inclusivity piece you can add into your things. Think about alt text, think about this, think about how
Yep.
you would describe that. So I love the tips that you're providing there. Uh, Rebecca,
Mhm.
we're nearing the end of our time, but this has been such a productive and fruitful conversation. I want to open up space for you. What would you want to tell the trainers, coaches, HR people listening? What would be your, call it your premier advice, or what is it that, like, hey, if you do nothing else, do these things, and that is going to help you take those first steps, or even like elevate or accelerate your inclusion and inclusivity in your trainings?
If there were a few things that I could say, if you were going to do nothing else that I've said today, but you want to do one thing, you really do have to start having conversations. And you have to start having conversations, even if it's not with big wigs. So maybe you're not the CEO, maybe you're not the CMO, maybe you're not the head of HR. Maybe you are just over learning and development, maybe you're a manager or something like that. We have to start having the conversations, even if it's within our own teams, as to how we can do itty bitty things. Accessibility doesn't have to be this huge production. Right now, I think a lot of people are scared of it because if you go and you look at WCAG standards, there's a lot that's there.
Mhm.
And if it's your first time looking at it, honestly, you're probably going to be like, this is overwhelming, and I'm going to click out and I'll think about it, but you might never go back again. So it's about thinking about the small things that you can implement without having to have extra money, without having to have extra backing. And like I said, evaluating what you've got. So, as Jay mentioned, alt text, something anybody can do. You can do it on a PowerPoint, you can do it in your training, you can do it pretty much everywhere, and it costs nothing. It costs all of half a minute to come up with a 5-word description. So it's absolutely simple to do. Closed captioning doesn't have to cost you a lot, if anything. There's AI now that will absolutely do it for you, and it provides a wealth of information, a wealth of opportunity, and a wealth of support. Creating a PDF version of something just to, I mean, we talk about those things all the time. Those are like job aids, one sheeters, very simple things. Accessibility does not have to be, I'm going to start off with a 3, 6, 12-month plan. It can be something that is small so that you at least start to build those things into your culture and they become more normalized. And then you can build on to bigger things. So, what I like to tell people is don't be scared of it. It can be intimidating and it can be scary for a lot of reasons. And if I'm being honest, for a lot of companies, it's scary because we are in an age where people are much more aware of it. They are much more vocal about it. And it's sometimes if you don't get it right, they're going to talk about it. And they're
Mhm.
going to talk about it in a larger forum. And it can be scary, but we all make mistakes. I make mistakes. And I mean, I live with somebody who's neurodivergent and I'm responsible for taking care of him and keeping him alive. So we all make mistakes and it's okay to make a mistake. When you make a mistake, if it's a public one, it's like, hey, my bad, my mistake. I didn't realize this. I realize this now. Going forward, we'll address it. There's 100 different ways to what you don't want to do is pull completely all the way back and pull the rug from under people who honestly are an untapped resource. We are spending money trying to find new people. We're spending money trying to find innovation and increase revenue and improve product when the people who can do that for us are sitting in the room. They're just waiting for the support so that they can show you the answers to all of these questions. So it really is about normalizing that conversation, doing small things, and realizing that these are your people. You don't usually have to go that far away to find your solution. Your people are in the building.
So much wisdom in that. So much wisdom in that. I love that, Rebecca. Let me tell you a couple of things. Is first of all, the comment that you made about, people are worried about engaging because, people are aware of it and they go, let me tell you, if you're not engaging, that doesn't stop people from talking about you
No.
if you're making those mistakes. So it's better to engage. It's better to be accountable to yourself and to
Yep.
your behaviors and to learn some humble pie. Sometimes, you know what? No one in the world has all of the answers or all of the right answers. We all make mistakes. And if we do it with humility and curiosity, it can be a growth and learning experience. So I love that. And I
Yes.
love the start small. As a behavioral scientist, this is one of the biggest things that, like, if you want to walk the mountain, don't look at the mountaintop. Take the first step, buy the equipment, do that, and then start all the other things. If you start small, if it's easy, you'll do it. If it's not easy, you
Yep.
won't. So such great wisdom there. Rebecca, how would our audience get in touch with you if they want to learn more, if they want to experience? more on the questions of how can I design, how can I think through these different aspects of neurodiversity and just inclusion in general.
Absolutely. So, a few ways somebody can reach me. Primarily, LinkedIn is a great way. I usually post almost every day, whether it's tips, strategies, whatever the case may be. I post pretty regularly. But in addition to that, I'm always available via email as well, Rebecca.Prejean at ebgc.net. My website, www.ebgc.net. And next week, I'm actually launching a community. It is not a Slack community. I promise no Slack, but it is about accessibility. And I've named it the Accessibility Think Tank. So it is for professionals. If you want to learn about accessibility, if you want to figure out how to design things, if you want to figure out things for your HR, I'm going to have a whole forum about it. We can literally talk about it. You can schedule time with me in the community. So I'm trying to build the community that we really should have as professionals to support one another because it's really not, there's almost no way we can win this particular battle without supporting one another. So I have templates, resources, all the things, and I plan on launching that next week. So if somebody were to be interested, they're more than welcome to reach out to me.
That is incredible. And I will be reaching out to you, Rebecca. So that is something that we can all improve on. Thank you so much for your time and for
Oh,
the
thank you.
incredible conversation. Really appreciate that. Yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So thankful for you having me. Absolutely.
And thank you, audience, for tuning into this episode of the Talent Forge, where we are shaping the future of talent development.